My name is Nora Callahan, and I was 31 years old the afternoon my brother-in-law rang my doorbell holding a manila envelope like it was a weapon he'd spent months sharpening. My husband was at work. My daughter was upstairs napping. The house smelled like coffee and the lavender candle I kept on the kitchen counter. Everything was ordinary. Everything was about to stop being ordinary. He held out the envelope and said, "I think you need to see this before the whole family does." I looked at the envelope. I looked at him, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not fear. Something older and quieter than fear. The specific calm of a woman who already knows the truth and has been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for someone else to catch up. Before I tell you what was in that envelope, I need to take you back 2 years. Because what happened at my door that afternoon wasn't really about a test. It was about a family that had been keeping a secret so much larger than mine that when it finally came out, there was nothing left standing. I want to start with the Callahans, because you can't understand any of this without understanding them first. The Callahans were the kind of family that had a story about themselves. Every family does. But theirs was polished. Told at holidays, repeated at funerals, handed down like good china. The story was this: they were solid people. Honest people. A family that had built everything from nothing, that valued loyalty above comfort and truth above appearances. Robert Callahan Sr. had started a construction company with 2 trucks and a handshake in the mid-80s. By the time I married his son, it was a regional firm with 40 employees and a reputation that preceded it into every room. His wife, Margaret, had raised 3 boys in a house with 1 bathroom and a lot of rules. She ran the family the way Robert ran the business. Efficiently, with an eye always on the bottom line. Their sons were Thomas, the eldest, Ryan, the middle, and Marcus, the youngest. I married Thomas. Thomas Callahan was 34 when we met, the kind of man who apologizes when he bumps into furniture. Quiet in groups, loud in private. He had his father's hands and his mother's precision, and a laugh that arrived slowly and then filled a room completely. I loved him before I was ready to. That's always been true. He caught me off guard. We married on a Saturday in September. The reception was in the Callahans' backyard because Margaret insisted, and I didn't fight it because I'd learned early that there were hills worth dying on with Margaret Callahan, and a reception venue was not one of them. Ryan was the best man. He gave a speech that was funny and warm and slightly too long, which was Ryan in every context. He loved his brother. That part was genuine. I believed it then. I still believe it now. Just because love is real doesn't mean it's enough to stop a person from doing damage. Marcus was the youngest by 6 years. 28 when I married Thomas. He had a different quality from his brothers. Sharper. Less settled. He'd worked for the family company for 3 years and then left to start something of his own, and the leaving had created a fracture that everyone in the family acknowledged by pretending it didn't exist. Marcus had a way of watching people that I noticed from the beginning. Not threatening. Observational. Like he was always running a quiet calculation no one else had access to. I paid attention to that, and then I put it aside because he was my husband's brother, and I had more important things to do than solve the riddle of Marcus Callahan. That was a mistake. Our daughter Lily was born 14 months after the wedding. I want to tell you about the day she was born because it matters to this story more than you might expect. Thomas was in the room. He held my hand through 12 hours, and he was present in a way that some men simply aren't, fully there, not managing his own discomfort. When Lily arrived and they put her in his arms, he made a sound I'd never heard from him before. Something that was past words. He looked at me over her head and said, "She has your eyes." She did. Deep brown, wide set. My eyes exactly. She did not have Thomas's eyes. Thomas's eyes were green. A clear, distinct green that he'd gotten from Margaret, who had gotten it from her own mother. Thomas's brothers had them too. Ryan's green. Marcus's green. It was a notable feature in the family. People commented on it. Lily's eyes were brown. No one said anything at the hospital. Of course they didn't. Babies' eye colors change. Everyone knows that. Margaret cooed over her. Robert shook Thomas's hand like they'd completed a business transaction. Ryan took 17 photographs in the first hour. Marcus stood at the back of the room and looked at Lily for a long time. I noticed. I filed it away. I didn't take it out again for almost a year. The first year with Lily was hard in the way the first year always is. Exhaustion as a permanent condition. Thomas took 2 weeks off and then the company pulled him back because there was a project in crisis and he was the only one who understood it. I didn't resent him for going. I resented the situation, which is different, though it doesn't always feel different at 3 a.m. Margaret came to help twice a week. This was both a gift and its own kind of labor. She had opinions about feeding schedules and sleep methods and the specific brand of wipes that was best. I smiled and nodded and mostly did what I was going to do anyway, which was Margaret's least favorite quality in a daughter-in-law, I think. Ryan and his wife, Donna, came on Sundays. They were easy company. Donna was uncomplicated in the best sense. She laughed at things because they were funny and worried about things because they were worrying and never had a secondary agenda that I could detect. Marcus came alone. He came sporadically, unannounced sometimes, which was his general mode of operating. He would sit in the kitchen and drink my coffee and watch Lily with that same quiet calculation I'd noticed at the wedding. He never pushed for information. He never said anything that I could point to as strange. But every time he left, I felt a faint something, not unease exactly, more like the feeling after a song ends that you're not sure you liked. When Lily was 11 months old, her eyes were fully, definitively brown. Margaret mentioned it once, casually at a Sunday dinner. She said, "Strange, isn't it, the brown? We've had green in this family for 4 generations." She said it to the table generally, the way you say something to the room when you want someone specific to hear it. I put down my fork. I looked at her. She smiled at me with her lips closed. Thomas said, "Genetics skips around, Mom. It's not a straight line." "No," Margaret said. "It certainly isn't." I held that exchange in my chest for a week. Thomas noticed nothing. Or he noticed and chose not to name it, which is different but would have the same result. He loved Lily with the uncomplicated force of a man who had never considered an alternative. She was his. That was the whole fact. He didn't require a second one. I loved him for that. I also watched the family more carefully after that Sunday dinner. Here is what I began to see. Margaret, for all her talk of the family story, the honest Callahans, the solid Callahans, was a woman who held a great deal in her hands and never let go of any of it. She knew things. She curated what she shared and when. There were conversations that stopped when I entered a room. There were looks between her and Marcus that I could not decode. Robert was quieter than he appeared. The patriarch presentation, the firm handshake, the 2 trucks and a handshake story, it was a surface. Underneath it, he was a man who had outsourced the management of his family to Margaret for 30 years and accepted the results without asking too many questions about the methods. Ryan was genuinely what he appeared to be. Warm, uncomplicated, a little oblivious. The middle child who had never had to develop the radar that youngest children develop. Marcus was the one who knew something. I became sure of this gradually, the way you become sure of weather coming before you can see it. A change in pressure. Something in the air. At Lily's first birthday party, Marcus arrived late. He stood in the doorway of the living room and watched Lily tear the paper off a gift, and his face did something that I saw from across the room. It lasted less than a second. Then it was gone, and he was smiling and making a toast with his beer like everyone else. But I had seen it. I just didn't know yet what I'd seen. Lily was 18 months old when I found the photograph. I was looking for an old insurance document in the filing cabinet Thomas kept in the study. 3rd drawer, behind the tax folders. I was not looking for anything else. I was not snooping. I was looking for a document. The photograph was in an envelope with no label. A printed photograph, the kind from a drugstore machine. Slightly worn at the edges, like it had been handled more than once. It was a photograph of a woman I didn't recognize. Dark hair, brown eyes, a smile that was doing its best. She was standing in front of what looked like a beach, somewhere with a lot of light. On the back, in handwriting I didn't recognize, was a date. 7 years ago. Before I met Thomas. I put it back. I told myself it was nothing. A photograph from before. Everyone has a before. But the brown eyes. I thought about the brown eyes. I didn't ask Thomas about the photograph. This is the part where people always want to know why. I'll tell you. Because I wasn't afraid of the answer. I was afraid of the question. Not what Thomas might say. What it would mean that I was asking. What door it would open in a marriage I was happy in a life I had built carefully and deliberately and loved. I was also, I realize now, waiting for the story to show itself. I'd learned from watching Margaret that information has its own arrival time. You can push it, or you can stand still and let it come to you, and the second way gives you more ground to stand on when it does. So I waited. I did not wait long. Marcus called me on a Thursday in March. Thomas was at work. Lily was at my mother's. He asked if he could come over. I said yes. He arrived in 20 minutes, which meant he'd been close when he called. He stood on my porch in a jacket that was too light for the weather, holding a manila envelope, and he looked at me with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not the calculation. Something else. Something that cost him something. I think you need to see this before the whole family does, he said. I let him in. We sat at the kitchen table. The coffee was still warm from the morning. He set the envelope between us and looked at it, and then looked at me. How long have you known? He asked. Known what? I said. A pause. Lily, he said. Lily is Thomas's daughter, I said. Evenly. Because she was. I knew she was. I had never been with anyone else. Not before Thomas, not after. Marcus looked at me for a long time. Then he opened the envelope. There were 2 documents inside. The first was a paternity test, processed through a private lab. It had Marcus's name on one line and Lily's name on another. I read it twice. Marcus Callahan. 99.9% probability of paternity. I sat with that for a moment. Then I looked up. You had a paternity test done on my daughter, I said. Nora, you collected her DNA without my knowledge or consent and had a test done. He had the grace to look uncomfortable. A birthday party. I saved a spoon. A spoon. From her first birthday party. He had saved a spoon. The calm in my chest held. Marcus, I said. I have never been with you. I have never been with anyone other than Thomas. This test is wrong. It can't be wrong. Then the lab made an error. Nora. His voice was careful. Carrying something. Look at the second document. The second document was a letter. Handwritten. 3 pages. A woman's handwriting, neat and careful at the top, less controlled as it went on. The letter was addressed to Robert Callahan. I read it slowly. Twice. Then I set it down and looked at the window for a while. The woman in the photograph. The one with the dark hair and the brown eyes and the beach behind her. Her name was Elena Marsh. She had worked at the Callahan Construction Company 14 years ago, before I had ever heard of any of them. She had worked there for 2 years. She had been in a relationship with Robert Callahan Sr. She had gotten pregnant. Robert had paid her to leave. Not dramatically, not cruelly, at least not in the way cruelty is usually presented. A quiet arrangement. A number with several zeros. A signed agreement. A woman who needed money and a man who needed a problem to disappear. Elena had a son. That son was Marcus. Marcus Callahan was not Robert's child by Margaret. He was Robert's child by Elena Marsh. Raised by Robert and Margaret as their own because Elena had signed away her rights and Robert had told Margaret a story, a carefully constructed, partially true story about a child from a previous relationship who needed a home. Margaret had agreed. Whether she had known the full truth then, or had figured it out later, or had chosen simply to absorb it without asking too many questions, the letter did not say. But Marcus had found the letter 2 months ago, in a box of his father's papers that Robert had asked him to sort through after a minor health scare. He had not been Robert and Margaret's biological child. He was Robert's son, but only Robert's. And if Marcus was Robert's son by another woman, then Marcus's DNA would carry half of Robert's genetic markers. Thomas also carried half of Robert's genetic markers. Half-brothers, sharing a father, could produce overlapping DNA results in certain test configurations. Especially cheaper private lab tests not designed for half-sibling differentiation. I understood it before Marcus finished explaining. The test wasn't saying Marcus was Lily's father. The test was saying Marcus and Thomas shared enough DNA to make the result ambiguous. The test was, in the worst possible framing, suggesting that Lily's father was a Callahan, which she was, because her father was Thomas. Marcus had run a test he didn't fully understand and arrived at the wrong conclusion, and he had come to my door with it because he was in the middle of a story about his own existence that had broken something in him, and he had made me part of the wreckage. I sat at my kitchen table and breathed. "You thought I'd had an affair," I said. "I thought, with you." He didn't answer. "You looked at brown eyes and a test you didn't understand, and you decided I had been with my husband's brother. The results are explained by the letter you just showed me," I said. "You and Thomas share a father. Half-sibling DNA overlaps. This test was never designed to distinguish between a half-uncle and a father. You needed a different test." The silence in the kitchen was very complete. Marcus looked at the letter. He looked like a man who had been carrying a bomb for 2 months and had just been told it wasn't a bomb, except that it was still a bomb, just not pointed at me. "Your mother and father," I said quietly. He didn't answer for a long time. "Robert and Margaret," he said finally, correcting my language, deliberately. "Does Thomas know?" "Nobody knows," Marcus said. "Just me. And now you. I want to stop here and ask you something. If you found out that the family you married into had been built on a secret that predated you by decades, what would you do? Would you tell your husband before you knew what it would cost him? Would you carry it alone for a while, the way I'd been carrying smaller things? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Because the part where this family comes apart at the seams is just around the corner, and you don't want to miss it. I did not tell Thomas that night. I know that sounds familiar. Another secret kept from a husband. But this one wasn't mine to tell first. I called Marcus after he left, and I said one thing. "You need to talk to your parents before I talk to Thomas." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What if they deny it?" "They can't," I said. "You have the letter." He said he needed time. I gave him 72 hours. Not because I was being hard on him, because I could see the weight he was under, and I wasn't made of stone. But I would not watch Thomas be kept outside of information about his own family for longer than 3 days. I had learned what that cost a marriage. The 72 hours passed. Marcus did not talk to his parents. So I told Thomas. I chose a Sunday morning. Lily was at my mother's again. The house was quiet. Thomas was reading at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee, and I sat down across from him and said, "I need to tell you something that is going to be hard to hear, and I need you to hear all of it before you react." He looked up. He put the coffee down. I told him about Marcus coming to the door. I told him about the envelope. I told him about the paternity test and what it actually meant and why. I told him about Elena Marsh. I told him about the letter. I told him all of it in one continuous thread because if I paused, I wasn't sure either of us would be able to continue. When I finished, he was very still. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went past. "Marcus found the letter 2 months ago," Thomas said. Not a question. Placing the timeline. "Yes." "And he came to you with a paternity test instead of coming to me." "Yes." "He thought you," he stopped. Started again. "He thought Lily." "Yes." Thomas stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there with his back to me for a long time, and I watched his shoulders and the set of his neck, and I did not rush him, because there was no rushing this. "My father had a son," he said to the window. "Yes." "Marcus is," he turned. "Marcus is my half-brother." "Yes." He looked at me. His face was doing several things at once. None of them were anger, not at me. There was something else in it. Something that looked like grief for a version of his family he had believed in. "Who else knows?" he said. "Just us," I said. "And Marcus." "And my parents." "Yes." He sat back down. He picked up his coffee cup and held it without drinking from it. He looked at the table. "I need to call Marcus," he said. "Okay." "And then I need to call my parents." "Okay." He looked at me. "You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," I said. "But thank you for saying it." The call between Thomas and Marcus lasted 45 minutes. I was in the other room. I didn't listen. I sat on the stairs and waited and thought about Elena Marsh, a woman who had taken a settlement and signed a paper and left a child behind. I thought about whether she'd made peace with it or whether she'd spent 14 years wondering. I thought about Lily upstairs in her crib at my mother's, brown eyes wide open, completely unaware that the family above her was shifting on its foundations. When Thomas came to find me, he looked older, not aged. Older in the way people look when they've just added weight they'll carry from now on. Marcus is coming over, he said. And then we're going to my parents' house. Do you want me there? He considered it. Yes, he said. I want you there. The drive to Robert and Margaret's house took 20 minutes. Marcus met us in the driveway. The three of us stood there for a moment in the cold before going in, which I think none of us wanted to do, but all of us understood we had to. Margaret opened the door before we knocked. She had seen the car from the window. Her face was a version of itself I hadn't seen before. Not warm, not cool. Braced. She knew. I was sure of it in that moment. She had known something was coming for days, maybe weeks. Maybe she had known since Marcus found the letter and had been waiting for this the way you wait for something you can't stop. Robert was in the living room. He stood when we came in. He looked at Marcus first, then at Thomas, then at me. He was 70 years old, and he looked all of it in that moment. Nobody sat down for a while. Thomas was the one who spoke first. He was always the one who spoke first in this family, the eldest, the one the weight fell to. Dad, he said. We know about Elena Marsh. Robert's jaw set. He looked at the floor. One brief moment of something crossing his face, what might have been relief, what might have been dread. Then he looked up. Where did you find the letter? He said. To Marcus. In the study, Marcus said. When you asked me to sort your papers. Robert was quiet. You asked me, Marcus said again. His voice was very controlled, and underneath it something was not controlled at all. You handed me the box. The room went very still. Were you ever going to tell me? Marcus said. A long pause. Marcus, Margaret said. Don't, Marcus said. Quietly. Just that word. Don't. He looked at his mother, his not mother, the woman who had raised him and loved him in her particular managed way, and his face did something I have never been able to fully describe. It was not anger. It was the face of a person standing in the ruins of a foundation they had believed was solid. Did you know, he said to her, from the beginning, did you know I wasn't yours? Margaret sat down, slowly, into the chair by the window. You are mine, she said, firmly, like a door being shut. That's not what I asked. A silence that had weight and texture and history in it. Your father told me there had been someone, Margaret said finally. Before we were married, he said. A child who needed a home. I believed that. She folded her hands. I chose to believe that. And when did you stop choosing to believe it? She looked at him for a long time. You have his eyes, she said. Robert's eyes. That's all the green in this family. I saw it when you were 2 years old. Robert made a sound. Not a word. You knew for 26 years, Marcus said. I knew you were loved, Margaret said. That's not the same thing. No, she said. It isn't. Thomas had not moved. He was standing by the door with his arms at his sides. I was beside him. I was watching him more than anyone else in the room. He said, Dad. Robert looked at him. You had a son, Thomas said. Outside your marriage. You paid his mother to leave. And you brought him into this house and let him grow up not knowing who he was. Robert's jaw worked. You built a company on honesty, Thomas said. You told us every year at Christmas that the Callahans don't hide from hard things. That we face them. Thomas. Which part of this was facing it, Dad? The room had no answer to that. Robert had no answer to that. He sat down in the chair across from Margaret, and he put his face in his hands, and the man who had started a company with 2 trucks and a handshake looked very small inside the story he had been carrying for 30 years. I'm going to tell you what happened in the weeks after that afternoon, because I know that's what you're waiting for. And I'm going to be honest about the parts that weren't clean, because none of them were. Marcus left the family business. Not immediately. 3 months later, after a series of conversations I wasn't present for and don't have the right to report in full. He left and started the company he'd been trying to build for years, and this time he built it without the weight of a family whose story he wasn't sure he was part of. He and Thomas did not stop speaking. This surprised me, and it moved me. Thomas called him every week, not to manage the situation, not to hold the family together in Margaret's way, with a tight grip and a pleasant expression. Just a call, to say he was his brother, half or otherwise. Marcus told me once, in a brief conversation over coffee that was the first one we'd had where I didn't feel the weight of the envelope between us, that the call he dreaded most had turned out to be the one that changed things. Thomas calling and saying, "None of this is your fault. You didn't choose what they did. You're still my brother." "I thought he'd be angry at me," Marcus said, "for coming to your door with that test."
"He was," I said.
"He was angry at you for that." Marcus nodded.
"He said so."
"He also said he was glad you were there that day." I thought about that for a moment. "He would have handled it differently without you," Marcus said. "He said you kept it steady." I didn't answer, but I held that for a while. Robert and Margaret did not divorce. I will tell you that plainly, because I know it's what you're wondering. They went to counseling, which surprised everyone, most of all Margaret, who had spent 50 years solving problems through management rather than admission. Something in that afternoon had cracked something open in her. Not her love for Marcus, that was genuine and had always been genuine, but the version of the family she'd been maintaining. She called me in October.
Just me.
Not Thomas. She asked if we could have lunch. I said yes. I'm not sure why. Reflex, maybe. Or the particular kind of curiosity that looks like forgiveness before it decides if it is. We sat in a restaurant on the east side of the city, the kind with good bread and low light. Margaret was wearing a gray coat I hadn't seen before. She looked like a woman who had recently put down something heavy and hadn't decided yet what to do with her hands. She said, "I owe you an apology." I waited.
"The brown eyes comment," she said.
At Sunday dinner, when Lily was a year old. I had not expected her to go back that far. "I was doing what I've always done," she said. "I was managing information." I suspected the test had come up in Marcus's mind. I was trying to preempt the conversation by implying I'd had an affair. She met my eyes. Yes. I let that sit.
"That was wrong," she said.
Not performed. Flat and direct in a way that Margaret rarely was. You had done nothing. Lily had done nothing. And I was protecting a secret that was never mine to protect. Whose was it? I asked. She thought about it honestly. Robert's, she said. And Elena's. And Marcus's. Everyone's except mine, really. I just spent 30 years deciding it was. We ate the bread. We drank the water. She asked about Lily, and I told her about the new word she was learning and the particular way she laughed when the dog next door ran past the window. Margaret listened. Not performing warmth. Actually listening. It was the most real conversation we had ever had. It was not a repair. A repair would have taken longer and required more than one lunch. But it was a door. The beginning of something that was not the relationship we'd had before, which frankly had not been a relationship so much as a performance we had both been giving. I didn't forgive her as she left the restaurant. I started thinking about it, which is how forgiveness actually starts, in my experience. Thomas went to find Elena Marsh. I want to be careful about how I tell this part because it wasn't my journey. I was beside it, not inside it. But I watched him make the decision, and I watched him come back from it, and those things belong to the story. It took him 2 months to find her. She was in Portland. She had built a quiet life, a bookshop, a small apartment, a garden that she posted photographs of online. She was 52 years old. She still had the dark hair in the photograph, shorter now, and the brown eyes, and a way of looking directly at the camera that told you something about her. Thomas flew to Portland on a Thursday. He didn't tell her he was coming. He found her at the bookshop and he introduced himself, and he watched her face go through several calculations at once. He said he hadn't come for answers. He said he'd come because Marcus deserved to know something about where half of himself came from, and that required knowing something about her, and that he didn't want to send Marcus to a stranger. She closed the shop early. They talked for 3 hours. He came home on Friday evening and I met him at the door, and we sat in the kitchen until midnight while he told me what she told him. I'm not going to repeat it. It was hers to tell, and Thomas told it to me in the spirit of a man who needed to put it somewhere, and it stays in that kitchen where it belongs.
What I'll tell you is what Thomas said at the end.
He was looking at his coffee cup, the way he looks at things when he's thinking in a straight line. She never stopped thinking about him, he said. She chose the money because she needed to survive. But she never stopped. I nodded. I'm going to tell Marcus, he said. I know, I said. He might not want to meet her, Thomas said. He might not, I agreed. But he should have the choice. Yes, I said. He should. Marcus met Elena Marsh 6 months later. Thomas had been right. Marcus needed the time. He sat with the information the way he sat with everything, carefully, running his calculations, coming out the other side of them. I don't know what that meeting was like. I wasn't there, and Marcus hasn't told me in full. What I know is that he called Thomas afterward and talked for an hour, and that Thomas came to find me when it was over and said, "He's okay," in a voice that was deeply relieved. And I know that Elena Marsh now has Marcus's phone number, and that she sent him a card on his birthday in April, and that he did not respond. That is a beginning. A careful, tentative, improbable beginning. Here is where I want to pause and tell you something I've been thinking about since that Thursday afternoon when Marcus came to my door with his manila envelope and his wrong conclusion. He had the right instinct and the wrong information. He had seen something real, the overlapping DNA, the shared genetic markers, and he had built a story around it that fit the fear he was already carrying. The fear that he didn't belong. That he had always been slightly outside the frame of the family, and here was the proof. The way outsiders always land on the wrong side of the evidence because the evidence is shaped by what you're afraid of. I don't forgive him for bringing that test to my door. Not entirely. There was a version of events in which Thomas found that envelope before I did, in which what Marcus brought into my house destroyed something that was solid and good and true. I think about that sometimes. The narrow margin between the story that happened and the story that could have. But I also understand the particular madness of finding out at 28 that the family you came from was built on a lie. That the woman who raised you had known since you were 2 years old and had chosen the closed door. That the man you called your father had built his empire on honesty and then done the least honest thing a person can do. Marcus had been standing in that wreckage for 2 months before he came to my door. He had been standing in it alone. He had made a bad decision in the middle of a crisis, which is something I have more sympathy for than I expected. We have coffee occasionally now. It is not easy. There is still the memory of the envelope on my kitchen table. There is still the fact of what he assumed. But there is also the fact of what he uncovered, not intentionally, not as a gift, but as a consequence of the same impulse that drove all of it. The need to know the truth. We are, cautiously and imperfectly, something like family. I want to tell you about the Sunday dinner in November. Thomas organized it. 6 months after the afternoon in Robert and Margaret's living room. He chose a restaurant, not the family house, because the family house had too much history in its walls now, and he wanted neutral ground. He asked everyone to come. Robert, Margaret, Ryan and Donna, Marcus. I sat beside Thomas. Marcus sat across from us. Robert and Margaret sat at one end, closer to each other than I'd seen them in months. Ryan, bless him, talked about his truck needing new brakes for 20 minutes because Ryan could find conversation anywhere and it kept the room warm while the rest of us figured out how to breathe. Toward the end of the meal, Robert cleared his throat, the way he did before announcements. Everyone was quiet. He looked at Marcus first, then at Thomas, then at the table. I know I owe more than I can say tonight, he said, but I want you to know, both of you, that I'm going to spend whatever time I have left earning it back. He paused. If you'll let me. Marcus looked at his water glass for a long moment. Then he said, ask me again in a year. Robert nodded. One slow nod. Accepting the terms. Thomas put his hand on the table, palm down. Marcus looked at it. Then he put his hand beside it, not touching. Just parallel. 2 hands on a white tablecloth in a restaurant in November. I watched that, and I felt something in my chest that I still don't have a clean word for. Something that was not exactly happiness and not exactly grief. Something in between.
The feeling of watching people try.
The weight and the possibility of that. Lily is 3 now. She is loudly, defiantly, joyfully herself. She has my eyes and Thomas's laugh and a way of announcing her opinions on breakfast that suggests she will be difficult and wonderful in equal measure. She calls Marcus uncle. She calls Robert grandfather. She has no idea of any of it. One day, in some version of the future, she will be old enough to hear the story, and Thomas and I will tell it to her the way you tell a child complicated truths, carefully, with love, not hiding the hard parts but also not making them the whole of it. The whole of it is that she comes from people who made real mistakes and also loved her before they ever met her, which is the human condition roughly, and she might as well start understanding it young. I think about the woman I was the afternoon Marcus rang my doorbell. The specific stillness I felt when I saw the envelope. I've tried to understand where that stillness came from.
It wasn't certainty, exactly.
I was certain of the truth about myself, but I didn't know yet what the truth was about everything else. I think it was the knowledge, accumulated in small doses over 2 years, that the Callahan family story had a draft underneath the published version. That the solid, honest people, the 2 trucks and a handshake, had a room in them that the tour didn't include. I didn't know what was in the room, but I knew the room existed. So when Marcus arrived with his evidence of the thing he'd built his story around, I had enough ground under me to stay still. I didn't panic. I didn't crumble. I read the documents. I asked the questions. I sent him back to face the real story, which was not about me at all. That's the thing about people who try to make you the problem. Sometimes the problem they're carrying is so much bigger than you that the moment you don't flinch, it falls back on them entirely. I didn't set out to expose a family's 30-year secret. I just declined to be the center of someone else's crisis. And in doing that, the truth had room to move where it actually needed to go. My name is Nora Callahan. My brother-in-law rang my doorbell with a paternity test and a theory that would have destroyed my marriage if I'd been a different kind of woman, or if the test had been designed differently, or if the truth had been quieter than it was. The test didn't destroy me. It destroyed the version of a family that had been propped up for 30 years by the willingness of everyone involved to leave one particular door locked. And in the destruction, in the rubble of that Sunday afternoon in Robert and Margaret's living room, something that might actually be a family started to be built. Slower, less polished. No story to tell at holidays, not the old one anyway, but real. That's the word I keep coming back to. Real in a way the old version never quite was. I sat on my porch last week and watched Thomas and Marcus walk back from the mailbox talking about something, I don't know what, some ordinary thing, and I thought about the manila envelope and the date on the back of the photograph and the letter in the filing cabinet and Elena Marsh's garden in Portland. All of it happened. None of it is finished happening. But the people walking back from the mailbox were 2 men who knew the truth about each other and had decided that the truth was not a reason to stop being brothers. That's not nothing. That's not nothing at all. If someone has ever tried to make you the story when the real story was something else entirely, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if this stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit subscribe if you haven't. I'll see you in the next one.